In this video, we will endlessly spawn our ground. Okay, it will never stop. We will endlessly spawn our ground. Okay, forever. So let's get into this topic. Let's do that. Okay, so I have a ground right over here. As you can see, I'm gonna make the z-axis, which is this one, okay, of this ground a little bit lower, something like 50. Oh, okay, so 50 is fine. So let's drag this ground right over here so player just can land on it. Okay, and what we want to do now in this ground, I'm gonna make a point at the end of this ground, something like over here. Okay, and I want to spawn a next ground from that point. Okay, to do so, so right click on this ground game object and create an empty child game object. Okay, let's call this game object or this point, let's call it next point or next pose. Let's call it next pose. Okay, so I'm gonna drag this next pose right something like over here at the end of this ground. Okay, as you can say, hold down all so you can look around. Okay, so I'm gonna drag it at the end of this. It can attach right over here, something like 0.5, I guess. Okay, so the 0.5 is pretty good, and you can select an icon for that. Go over to inspector and you can choose an icon you like. So I'm gonna choose a yellow. So from this point I want to spawn the next round right over here. So we need a access to this point or this position so I can spawn the next round from this point. Okay, so what we have to do, we need to make a prefab of this. Basically this ground means copy of that game object. So let's go to project tab, assets, right click, create folder. Okay, let's call this folder prefabs. Okay, and let's select this ground and drag it to that prefab folder. Okay, and what we want to do, we will create a spawner script. Okay, ground spawner script. In that script we will handle the spawning. Okay, so what we want to do, so you can note the position right over here of this ground. Okay, which is 0 in the x, minus 3.5 in the y, and z in the 6.1. Okay, so let's create a spawner script to spawn our ground. Okay, to do so, let's go to assets, then script folder, right click, create C# script. Okay, name it to something like ground spawner. I already have created that over here. It has, okay, it have. So I'm gonna go to hierarchy, right click, create empty game object. Let's call this game object as well as ground spawner. Okay, spawner, sorry, ground spawner. And what we want, let's reset the transform of this game object. Okay, and let's drag the script to add component section. Basically you need to attach that and double click that to open up in Visual Studio. So as you can see, we have start function and start function right over here, and the update function. Okay, so what we need, let's create another function for spawning. Okay, for spawning we will use another function. Let's go to bottom. Over here we will create, make sure you making it public because we want to call this function from another class, so that's why we making it public. Okay, and for function we have to type void. Let's call this function spawn. Okay, and make first bracket and some curly brackets. Okay, so what we want to do inside this function we want to spawn. Okay, to spawn anything, we know we have to use this instantiate function, and instantiate function as a first argument will take the game object you want to spawn. So as a first argument we will pass that ground spawner copy what we want to spawn, and the second thing is the position we will pass. Okay, and the third thing, rotation. Okay, so let's assign those first. Let's go to top of our class. Okay, top of our class. So firstly let's make a public game object, let's call it something like ground spawner prefab or copy, you can say. Sorry, not ground spawner, sorry, ground prefab. Okay, prefab. And the second thing, we need a position from where we want to spawn. Okay, so let's create a public vector 3. Okay, vector 3, let's call it next spawn post. Okay, next spawn post, and let's close that off with semicolon. Control S to save your code, and let's move to Unity. Okay, firstly we need to assign those variable one by one, then we can spawn it. Okay, so just wait. Just wait, and so you can note the position of this ground, which is if I move to this ground, okay, which is minus 3.5 in the Y. So I'm going to go to ground spawner, and next spawn post in the Y I will set minus 3.5. Okay, 3.5. And in the Z, if I note, which is 6.1, so I'm going to set it to 6. Okay, 6. And let's delete this ground from this in view now. Okay, in view now. Instead of what we want, so we note out the position. Okay, so if I go to ground spawner, so as you can see ground prefab which says none, empty. So what we will do, let's move to prefab folder and let's drag the ground right over here. Now we have the ground and as well as the first position. Okay, so let's double click that to open up in Visual Studio, and let's remove those these two slashes. Okay, first thing it will take the ground, so let's pass our ground prefab, which is the ground prefab. We drag it into that field. Okay, and let's pass right over here next spawn post as a and we assign it the next spawn post, as you can see. So it should be right over here, which is minus 3.5 in the Y, 0 in the X, and 6 in the Z axis. Okay, and third thing, it will take the rotation, so we don't want any rotation, so let's pass quaternion dot identity. It's basically means no rotation, and close that off with semicolon. So and what we want in the next thing, let's firstly store this into another variable. So we spawning this ground prefab at this point. Okay, we assign it, as you can see right over here, the position and with no rotation. So let's store this ground prefab into another variable. Okay, so that will also be an game object. Okay, let's call it temp ground or temporary ground, you can say. Temp ground, let's set equal to this. Okay, so we firstly, what we doing, we instantiating this ground prefab at this point with no rotation, and then we storing that ground, whatever we spawned, we definitely spawned the ground, and then we spawned that ground, and we taking that ground and storing another variable or container, you can say, as you can see right over here, temp ground. So what we want to change this point for the next time. We don't want to spawn simultaneously two grounds at same position like this. Okay, so what we want to change this next position, next position with our ground, that next spawn post. So if I move to Unity, okay, then prefabs, and open up this ground prefab, as you can see, we have created a next spawn post right over here. Okay, at the end of the ground. So we need to access of this position, so we can change it. So we will set the next spawn position. Okay, so next spawn post, we will set equal to temp ground. Okay, temp ground dot transform dot get child. Okay, so 0 is the first child. Basically what we're doing right over here, we just taking this ground, and then by this ground we're going to this ground transform component, and by this transform component we accessing the first child. As you can see, this ground have only one child, so it's referencing 0 is the first child. Okay, so we will move to this game object, or basically transform dot get child, which is the first, and then transform dot position, okay, and close that off with semicolon. So we setting the next pose, basically we changing this next pose, okay, next pose with second whatever we spawn it, that ground, that child game object position, we replace the we changing this next spawn pose. So firstly we instantiated that ground prefab at this point with no rotation, then we storing that ground into this temp ground, okay, temp ground, and we going to temp ground, basically that ground game object, and then we accessing the first child, okay, right over here. As you can see, temp ground dot transform dot get child, basically referencing this one, okay, this next spawn pose, and then we going to this transform and position of this child. As you can see, transform then position, okay. So we changed this next spawn pose with this, okay. So we also need to call this function, we made the function, we need to call it, okay. So let's call it in the start of the game, okay. So we will use this for loop, okay, for loop. Let me explain, sorry. So type right over here for and tap twice, basically press down tap twice simultaneously, so it will structure up the code for loop, okay. So right over here I'm gonna check for 3, okay. So this for loop start from 0, as you can see, and it will go up to 3, okay. So let's suppose this 0, okay, for the first time 0, 0, it's a start from 0. So we do know that 0 is lesser than 3, okay. So whatever you write in between these curly brackets, okay, will be execute. So what we want to call this spawn function, and what spawn function is doing, it just is spawning the ground at this point with no rotation. And the second, if we call this second time this spawn ground, okay, so it will change the position, okay. Just gonna this position will be changed with the ground child position, okay. So the next ground will be spawned from that child for the first ground, okay, from for the first ground child position. From that the next ground will be spawned, okay. And so let's call this function, so let's call it spawn function, and make first brackets and close that off with semicolon, and I plus plus, so 0 plus 1 will be 1 now. So if this right over here for loop runs second time, okay, so I over here is 1, and we do know that I is still 1 is still lesser than 3, so this spawn function will also call, okay. So because the condition right over here is true, okay, and then what we doing, I plus plus, so 1 plus 1 now becomes 2, okay. So this I over here is now 2, and we do know 2 is still lesser than 3, okay. So that's why this spawn function will still call out, and we know if we call this spawn function, it will spawn the ground. So and now this 2 plus 1 right over here becomes 3, and right now I is 3, and we do know that I is 3 is not lesser than 3, so the condition over here it's not true at all now. So that's why this spawn function will stop calling. So it will call 3 times, this spawn function will be called 3 times, okay. So 3 ground we will able to see basically in this scene view, okay. And we we made it start function, and we know start function get called in the start of the game, and it just called one time. So in the start of the game we should able to see 3 ground will be spawned one by one next to each other, okay. So control S to save your code. Now let's move to Unity. We should able to see that that ground will be spawned from this next spawn post, okay. So I'm gonna go to here. Now let's hit this play button. We should able to see 3 ground will be spawned just right after the game start, one by one. As you can see, 3 ground just spawn it, okay. You can see right over here in the hierarchy 1, 2 and 3, okay. So what we want endlessly that ground to be spawned. We don't want to spawn just 3 times or 4 times. Instead, we want to spawn that ground endlessly. So what we gonna do now? We will go to that prefab this ground, okay, and we will add up another box collider, okay. To do so, select this ground and go over to inspector, click on add component and find over there box collider, okay, and we will edit the collider. So click on this edit collider, okay, this one right over here. Let's drag it up, okay, something like this, I guess. And make sure you go to box collider and you check this one is triggered to true. Make sure that, okay, and also make sure you assign it this ground with some certain tag. So I assign it this ground as a ground tag, as you can see in the inspector. To do so, it will be untagged, okay. So what you need to do, click on add tag and hit this plus icon, name the tag what you want, click on save, and then go to that game object one more time, go to inspector and assign it that tag with whatever you name it, okay, with that tag, okay. So I'm gonna go to now. So we assign it this, if I drag this ground right over here, this ground as a ground ground tag, as you can see right over here. So we will check, what we will check, we will move to player script, okay. So double click that to open up in Visual Studio and we will use this on trigger enter 2D function, okay. So make sure you type the same name, on trigger enter 2D function, right over here. So this function get called when we trigger with something, okay, trigger with something or collide with something. And we do know we definitely gonna collide with this ground. As you can see, we made a box collider and we said this is triggered to true. So we will check right over here if we collide with something or with if we trigger with this ground, okay. So let's firstly let's print out a message in the console if it's working correctly or not. For printing out, we have to type debug.log. Do it inside player script, make sure, okay, debug.log, and let's print out the name of the game object. And by this other parameter we can extract info whatever we collided with. We can extract anything we like. So for now, let's go to other, whatever we triggered it with, that other than game object, accessing the whole game object. Whatever we triggered it with, we definitely gonna trigger with that ground, okay. So we will print out the name, so dot name, and close that off with semicolon, control S to save your code. Now let's move to Unity and select the console in the bottom and hit this play button in the top. We should able to see that message gonna pop up, and the name of the game object will be spawned, which is ground, as you can see right over here. So let's hit this play button. We should able to see the name of the game object will be spawned right away when we trigger or collide with this box, as you can see ground, okay. So the message gets pop up when we trigger. We should able to see that will be over here, as you can see, okay. So basically when we trigger with something or collide, you can say well, that message just popping out. So instead of printing out message, what we want to spawn the next ground. Basically we will call that spawn ground, in ground spawner script we made is a spawn function, okay. So we will call that function, and we do know that what that function is exactly doing. It just is spawning the ground with the next spawn post from the whatever we spawn it, that at the end of that point we spawning the next one, okay. So let's do that. So let's call, instead of printing out message, firstly we will check whatever we triggered it with or collided with, if that game object has a tag ground, and we don't know, we assign it the ground as a ground tag, and we definitely gonna trigger with that. So we will check firstly if other, okay, other dot game object dot tag, okay, whatever we trigger it with. So we will check if that game object has tag ground, okay, and make some curly brackets, okay. So So firstly we checking if we trigger with something, okay, this function will call out, and we checking right over here whatever we trigger it with. If that game object, if other dot game object, we accessing that tag of that game object, and we checking if that tag is equals to our ground. So what we want, we definitely gonna trigger with that box collider of that ground. So we want to spawn the next ground, or basically we want to spawn the ground. So what we have to do right over here, we have to use this find. You can use this find object of type statement, and into arrows you have to pass the script name. Okay, so we will pass our ground spawner script and make first packet, and in there we created that spawn function and we made it public. Okay, so dot, we will call that function which is the spawn one, and make first packet and close that off with semicolon. Control S to save your code. Now let's move to Unity. So whenever we trigger with this box collider, we should able to see the next ground will be spawned. Okay, and it will go and so on, it will be never stopped. Okay, so we should able to say, let's hit this play button, and if we trigger with the next one, we should able to see the next ground will be spawned. Okay, so we should able to see, sorry, I'm just having the tea. Okay, oh, as you can see, the next ground is spawning. You will be able to see, as you can see, and it's going forever. So what we need to do now, we need to delete this ground. Okay, left behind, whatever the left behind grounds. Okay, we need to delete this one. We don't need it anymore from the hierarchy or this in view, this one. So it will hold too many game objects, so that's why we want to delete after some time, when the player totally passed through this ground. Okay, we want to destroy after some time, so destroy it. So let's open up the player script. Okay, go to player script, or to destroy we will use this on trigger exit function. Okay, and this function get called when we trigger out from a box collider. So we definitely gonna trigger out from here. We will left this box collider on, we are not gonna collide or trigger with this anymore, this box collider when we are over here. So that function will be called, and in that function what we want, we will firstly check whatever we trigger it out, if that game object, so other dot game object dot tag. Okay, if it's equal to half round, then what we want, make first bracket, then we want to destroy that game object. Whatever we trigger it out, we definitely gonna trigger out that ground. Okay, so we will destroy, so we have to use this destroy function for that. Okay, and as a first argument it will take the other, so we will pass other dot game object, basically whatever we trigger it out, and we definitely gonna trigger out that ground. So this other dot game object over here means the ground. Okay, and as a second argument you can specify the time, so let's do it 5f, basically means 5 seconds. Okay, and close that up with semicolon. Control S to save your code. Now let's move to Unity. We should able to see when we trigger out this ground, that ground will be destroyed after 5 seconds. Okay, so let's hit this play button in the top, and we should able to see that's gonna happen right away. Okay, just wait. After 5 seconds this ground should destroy. Okay, this ground should destroy. So let's see, so you can count down the time. We should, as you can see, after 5 seconds every ground which is left behind is destroying itself after 5 seconds. Okay, so by this our hierarchy will be lot more cleaner as well as the same view. I hope you get the idea how you can spawn endless ground forever. Okay, and lastly, thanks for watching this video.